Hello, my name is Aaliyah Garrett. I'm Sarasota County Extension Sustainability Outreach Coordinator, and this presentation is called Climate Change, Fundamentals, and Regenerative Solutions. So we'll be covering that today. I'm going to go to the outline quickly, but if you have any questions, you can always email sustainablesarasota@sc, like Sarasota County, gov.net. But today we're going to be covering climate change, just a quick overview, talk about those fundamentals. We'll talk about environmental policy and then move into regeneration. The last part of the presentation is based off of a book by Paul Hawken. So we'll talk about the frameworks in that book and then also some of the solutions. I will say there is a lot of solutions, which honestly is very, it's a good thing. So we're just going to touch on some of them today, but not all. I love this photo. I always like starting out some of my presentations with this photo. It's called Earthrise, and it's actually the first picture taken outside of Earth of our planet. And this really helped kind of spark that environmental movement initially years ago. Because it's just a little pale blue dot. That's all we have. There's nothing else. This is where we are. This is our home, and we do need to take care of it. So what is climate change? Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. So weather does not equal climate. Weather is kind of the day-to-day based on like seasons. Climate is long-term. So warmer and cooler temperatures over time, which is the important part, are changing weather patterns and disrupting the usual balance of nature. So even the most recent example, Hurricane Ian, we're seeing a lot stronger storms, a lot more storms. So that would kind of be an effect of climate change. So the causes are global. It's entangled in every human activity, even breathing. We breathe out carbon. And the impacts are global. So no one is exempt from the negative impacts. We're all in it together. It's the common fate of humanity. So inequity, we're going to talk about this a lot today. Equity is very important and infused in everything that we do and in every solution that regeneration has. But mainly there's massive inequity between the causes and the impacts. So the poor are often the least responsible, but the most impacted. They have the burden of drought, flooding, extreme weather, sea level rise, and it's already happening, especially to the countries that mostly don't and people who mostly don't cause climate change. So for people facing financial hardship, they are not contributing to fast fashion, to consumerism, driving cars, generally. So that is something, yet they're living in places that often have droughts and floods and things that they cannot escape and have to deal with. So climate change is long-term, but also abrupt. As I had mentioned, we see those long-term trends, but right now we're seeing stronger and more frequent storms, fires, and other things that are happening right now. There is uncertainty that remains about its effects and impacts. I will say most scientists are on the same page, despite certainty about what is happening and what is causing it. But this is both a justification for precautionary principle, better safe than sorry, and also for delay in inaction. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, so we can just wait. But we also have to bring into question the moral status for our future generations. Do we sacrifice for them? A question of attribution. How much is a result of human activity and how much of this is natural? If it's not human caused, then solutions are about adaptation rather than limiting emissions. But the reverse is also true. Either way, we need to take action. Robustness. How much can the earth and our ecosystems withstand from human activities? So this is a little bit more up for debate in the scientific community. Some scientists think we're underestimating Earth's coping mechanisms, and others think we're dangerously overestimating. So this is a question of risk. If we can't predict the future, what level of risk is tolerable? And the role of economic costs also factor into this. Will it be more expensive to ignore climate change or to deal with it right now? More about risk, small island states, they want a 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum warming target is the official global goal of international climate policy. Others don't want an explicit target at all, and those are climate laggards. Those are people who don't want to make any commitments and are worried about spending money on that. The difference in this comes from different perceptions of risk. So risk tends to be bearable in the international community when they are being borne by the poor and geopolitically less significant. So as I mentioned before on the inequity slide, the poor countries and poor people are the least responsible, but currently having the worst impacts of it. So that's why it still seems bearable in other countries and why they lag behind in forming climate policy. So on to climate science. There is a consensus on climate change and its human cause among experts. Approaches look for evidence and trends in the past. So for example, looking at gas trapped in ice cores, that's an empirical, tangible way to test. And this is not too controversial. So climate skeptics continue to debate about the methodology and validity of dominant science. So they argue that climate change is just a normal variation, and for them, catastrophic climate change is not true, fiction. But I love this quote. It says, although hardly credible science now denies man-made climate change, raising doubt about attribution remains the key point of attack. So that is very important. We can't just keep denying it. We do need to take action now. So the IPCC, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was formed in the 80s, and it serves as the definitive voice in communicating the science of climate change. So they review cycles, they look at existing scientific peer-reviewed data, and they write reports. So they're painstakingly researched and written, and this is the most credible guide for climate change internationally. So environment as a policy problem. There are 7 main aspects that make the environment a unique policy problem, and we're going to cover all of these. So public goods, transboundary problems, complexity and uncertainty, irreversibility, temporal and spatial variability, administrative fragmentation, and regulatory intervention. So public goods. Essentially, each individual's consumption leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption of that good. So this results in collective action problems. The benefits are concentrated while the negative impacts diffuse. So this is private gain and public expense. Essentially, I can stop consuming as many goods as I can possibly do in an effort to be more sustainable and fight consumerism and consumption. However, if everyone else isn't doing that, it doesn't really make an impact. And that's why I do want to say, a lot of people think, oh, you know, I'm just one person, it doesn't really matter. But if all of us think that, then that is true. So it's really important just to have an attitude of, I make a difference. Transboundary problems. So environmental concerns do not respect political boundaries. And one country may take action trying to limit climate change. This can't prevent others from free riding and not doing anything at all. Complexity and uncertainty. It's difficult to identify complex causal relationships that are interdependent. We live in a multi-causal world, and ecosystems are non-reducible. So they can't be fixed by addressing discrete parts and isolation. And a lot of the things that we do that could seem like a solution may have unintended consequences. For example, DDT. Irreversibility. This differs, climate change and caring for our Earth, it differs from other policies in this way because it may be hard to correct once environmental damage is done. So for example, species extinction, that's not something we can undo. So there is a big pressure to get things right the first time. Temporal and spatial variability. These are long-term time horizons. Fixing climate change is not just something that we can do in a day. We may need to adopt remedial policies before the worst impacts are set in. So really focusing on that long-term planning. Self-sacrifice for people who haven't been born yet. The impacts of pollution are often felt far from the source, and the cost of environmental problems are unevenly distributed. So in short, I love this quote by Neil Carter. It is easier to make policy that responds to today's political pressure than to address tomorrow's environmental problems. So that's very true. A lot in the United States, for example, we have really short time horizons with our politicians. Presidents are 4 years, 8 max. So they want to run on policies that are important to the right now without thinking long term. Administrative fragmentation. So there's narrow sectoral interests of our agencies. So there is the Department of Agriculture, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Energy. But environmental problems do not respect these artificially institutional boundaries. So intersecting policy response is needed. We can't fix our environment in our own little silos. We really do need to communicate and be on the same page, because a lot of the problems that we're facing are extremely interconnected. Regulatory intervention. So environmental damage is often caused as a byproduct of otherwise legitimate activities. So the regulations aren't as great as they should be. So some of the pollution is legitimate. They're allowed to be emitting as much as they do. And there is a race to the bottom with regulation. So as low as we can possibly make them, but we do need a mix of both legal and regulatory instruments. All right, so that's kind of the fundamentals of what climate change is, why it's a policy problem, and now I want to talk about what can and should we do. So this takes us into regeneration. So the second half is based on Paul Hawken's book. This is what the cover looks like, and it is becoming the world's largest, most complete listing of network solutions to the climate crisis and how we do them. So we'll go ahead, and I do love this quote. It's on their website, and it says, "The heating planet is our commons. It holds us all. To address and reverse warming requires connection and reciprocity. It calls for moving out of our comfort zones to find a depth of courage we may have never known. It calls for action that is bold and fearless." So regeneration puts life at the center of every action and decision. It applies to all life: grasslands, farms, insects, forests, fish, wetlands, coastlands, and oceans. It applies equally to families, communities, cities, schools, religion, commerce, and governments, and most spectacularly to our climate. And I've mentioned earlier in the presentation that it really is going to take us all. We cannot solve the climate crisis just by focusing on the environment in separate pieces. We also need equity infused in all of our decisions moving forward. So now we're going to talk about the frameworks for action. So there are 6 basic frameworks that will solve the climate crisis. They overlap in many ways. However, each category holds multiple levels of discovery, innovation, and breakthrough. So the first framework is equity. And as I mentioned, this is first because it encompasses everything. Everything must be infused with equity. Social systems require the same level of care, attention, and kindness as ecosystems. They are incomparable yet inseparable. And basically, the state of the environment accurately reflects the violence, injustice, disrespect, and harm we do to people of different cultures, beliefs, and skin colors. The second framework is to reduce. The primary method of reversing global greenhouse gas emissions is simple. We need to stop putting them into the atmosphere. It is also the most difficult while being the greatest economic opportunity to transition to renewables. Reducing puts an end to emissions from agriculture, transport, food systems, deforestation, desertification, and ecosystem destruction. The implementation of renewable energy from wind, solar, energy storage, and microgrids are critical, and they are well on their way. Protect. So protect is synonymous with preserving, safeguarding, and defending. So terrestrial systems hold 3.3 trillion tons of carbon in and above the ground. So that's about 4 times as much carbon than is in the atmosphere. The carbon is contained in forest lands, peatlands, wetlands, grasslands, mangroves, tidal salt marshes, farmland, and rangeland. And if we lose 10% of the Earth's terrestrial systems, those emissions could increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by as much as 100 parts per million. Sequester. So there is a natural carbon cycle that's been functioning for hundreds of millions of years, and carbon moves in and out of the atmosphere. So forests, plants, phytoplankton, they take in carbon dioxide and convert it to oxygen and carbohydrates. Plants do this through photosynthesis. They breathe in the carbon and release oxygen for us. So roughly 25% of our carbon emissions are absorbed by the oceans. And this is done through regenerative agriculture, managed grazing, replanting mangroves, protecting existing ecosystems, and more. So those are some of the solutions. But we need to reduce atmospheric carbon levels back to pre-industry. Influence is number 5. So influence encompasses laws, regulations, subsidies, policies, and building codes. It is the one thing to cease using plastic bags. It is better to get single-use plastic banned than to ask people to not use it. So you can't fix pollution, degradation, or plastic downstream on the consumer individual level. The cause is upstream, and that is where the influence needs to be directed. So some actions that we can take are purchasing policies of one school, city, or business, exerted in the form of letters, emails, messages to corporations, and also trade organizations. Number 6 is support. So there are tens of thousands of organizations already doing amazing work on these issues. So you can plug yourself in, you can volunteer, contribute, and encourage. There are links within the Nexus in the Action Connection section of the online regeneration and also in the book. And this offers lists of the organizations around the world that are true regenerators. All right, so those were the 6 frameworks, and now we're going to talk about solutions. So these are all of the solutions that are listed in the book. So it's oceans, forests, wilding, land, people, the city, food, energy, industry, and action and connection. So these are the 6, and there are sub-solutions within each of them. We're going to talk about just a couple of sub-solutions, because as I mentioned in the beginning, there are so many, which is a good thing. So we're going to start out with oceans. So oceans absorb the greatest impact of human activity on the planet and receive the least coverage. So they are beginning to fail under the effects of heating, acidification, predatory overfishing, and unchecked pollution, both chemical and plastic. So the oceans contain 12 times more carbon than land and 45 times more than the atmosphere. They have absorbed 93% of atmospheric heating and 25% of carbon dioxide emissions, which is just unreal to think about. But by absorbing all of that carbon, it results in warmer water and acidification because the decrease of the pH from the atmospheric carbonization or carbon dioxide dissolving into the seawater. Oceans, the capacity of the oceans to continue is as carbon and heat sinks is reaching its limit. So we must protect and regenerate our oceans while also meeting human needs. So the first step is to cease using the oceans as a dump. And the second step is to create marine protected areas. So our regenerative solutions that are mentioned in drawdown are marine protected areas, SEAFORESTATION, mangroves, tidal salt marshes, seagrasses, and azolla fern. So we are going to be talking about marine protected areas and SEAFORESTATION. Those are the 2 solutions we are going to be talking about in this presentation. If you want to learn more about the others, the website is linked on every single slide, so you can find more about those. All right, so marine protected areas preserve expanses of wilderness areas in the planet's oceans and coastlines. So they regenerate degraded, overfished, and overshelled areas, be they open or coastal. And they also serve and protect human cities from storm surge, hurricanes, sea level rise, and carbon capture. So there's often this thing called the 30 by 30 approach, and scientists have concluded that 30% of the planet's seas can be protected by 2030. So marine protected areas are a very low-tech, cost-effective strategy that sequesters carbon and helps protect and enhance our coastlines. Seaforestation. So the seas can turn carbon into forests at a rate that exceeds the luscious parts of the Amazon. When I found this out, I was very pleasantly surprised. So on land, much of the carbon is eventually returned to the atmosphere via the decomposition of leaves and wood. So when a tree dies, it just falls on the ground, releases that carbon again. So carbon stored in the ocean plummets down to the ocean floor, where it won't be able to contribute to the greenhouse gas effect for centuries or millennia, if not even longer. So this means that restoring marine forest has a larger opportunity to draw down carbon than growing land plants. So seaforestation includes the cultivation of macroalgae and sea lettuce. All right, so that was oceans. Now we're going to move on to forests. So these are just amazing ways of sequestering carbon as well as taking care of animals. So our top priority within forest is protecting old growth forests from destruction. So another priority is reforesting land that has been cleared or degraded by human use. Replanting must be done equitably without destroying native diversity and causing forced eviction of native populations. So the regenerative solutions within forests that we're going to be talking about is proforestation and bamboo, but there are also boreal forest, tropical forest, afforestation, peatlands, agroforestry, and fire ecology. So proforestation is that the required land is already forested, whether as intact old growth forest or as degraded forest that needs to recover and grow. So proforestation would have a 40 times greater impact between now and 2100 than newly planted forest. So only 12% of intact forests are protected, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. They're mostly exploited for timber harvesting and agriculture. Bamboo. I love bamboo. I can't get over how amazing it is. It's a multi-purpose natural climate solution. So why is bamboo amazing? It's food for humans and pandas. It grows rapidly. It reaches maturity in 5 years. It regenerates without reseeding. It sequesters carbon. It loves both sunlight and shade. It grows in degraded land. It's attractive and also has deep cultural value. It's lightweight, yet incredibly strong, and anything made from wood can be made from bamboo. Wilding. So wilding is everywhere. It's not just a distant forest, but right outside of your home. A lot of the times people think, oh, nature is that park down the road or there's the beach, but it really is right when you walk outside. We destroy wilderness when we plow wetlands, set bait traps for wildlife, overfish, and more. So regenerative solutions that are listed in the book are trophic cascades, grazing ecology, wildlife corridors, grasslands, rewilding pollinators, wetlands, beavers, and bioregions. We're going to be talking about grazing ecology and beavers in this section. So grazing ecology. Grazing provokes grass regrowth by removing old, decayed, or dead plant tissue, which allows more sunlight to reach the base of the plant where most growth takes place. So animal dung and urine also supply natural fertilizers to the plants. This is ecological symbiosis. Both the plants, the grasses, and the animals benefit. So over millennia, grazers have become an intimate part of grassland ecosystems. Whether a large herd or a small cluster of animals, they are an essential component of life on Earth. Beavers. These are nature's best water restoration technologies. They slow down water flows from streams and rivers behind beaver dams, which increases groundwater recharging significantly. Also, they are very cute, which is a plus, a bonus. And they are referred to as Earth's kidneys. Silt builds up upstream on their upstream sidewalls and collects toxins such as pesticides or fertilizers. that are broken down by microbes. And dams also store carbon. They reverse erosion, and they terraform watery cradles from salmon to sawflies to salamanders. Land. So plowing on land exposes the soil to air, and its carbon was oxidized, breaking into the carbon cycle. Living ecosystems were turned into lifeless dirt that is easily eroded. Pesticides and herbicides killed off life in the soil, reducing the land around the world to deserts. Food for insects and other creatures became scarce. The land suffered, as do the people who depend on it. Some of the regenerative solutions that are mentioned is regenerative agriculture, animal integration, degraded land restoration, composting, rain barrels, and biochar. So we're just going to be focusing on regenerative agriculture. And we do have a sustainable agriculture agent at our office. He is just an expert in this, and it is very important, especially in our Sarasota community. A lot of people don't realize we are a very agricultural heavy community. So regenerative agriculture. Soil is an ecosystem. It comprises trillions of living, diverse organisms. When you gather, I recently found this out and thought it was amazing. When you gather a teaspoon of healthy soil, you have at hand one of the most complex living things on earth. Millions of farmers are implementing methods to reverse the loss of soil health, and regenerative systems in agriculture include agroforestry, agroecology, silvopasture, pasture crippling, real organics, and advanced rotational grazing. Specific methods within those include no-till, complex cover crops, prairie strips, perennial crops, animal integration, and crop diversification. So we're going to go into a few of these, but again, we're just touching the surface. Okay. Industrial agriculture feeds the plants with chemical forms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Regenerative agriculture feeds the soil rather than feeding the plants, and it's microbes, and the soil feeds the plants then. So here are the basic principles and techniques of regenerative agriculture. So we want to recarbonize the soil. We want to limit disturbance, cover the soil, hydrate the soil, put creatures on the soil, and recognize that soil health is planet health and also human health. So we're going to go through each of these sub topics within regenerative agriculture. So we want to recarbonize the soil. Taking carbon out of the air and storing it in soils and plant material is essential. The carbon is mainly stored in soil when plants, animals, and microorganisms get decomposed after their death, and the carbon is stored in their biomass. We want to limit disturbance. Mechanical disturbance of the soil should be curtailed as much as possible, tillage especially. Plowing destroys soil structure. So no-till and reduced-till systems allow the soil to evolve, build, expand in breadth and complexity. So when the soil is plowed repeatedly, soil life is exposed to the sun and weather, which causes it to dry out and die. We want to cover the soil. Cover crops protect the soil in winter and cool it in the summer. The idea is to keep as much green on top of the soil for as long as possible in order to prevent wind and water erosion while creating a habitat for organisms. So cover crops also soften the impacts of rainstorms so that water reaches the ground gently. So some examples of cover crops are cowpeas, buckwheat, plantain, sunflowers, daikon radish, and more. So we also want to hydrate the soil. I thought this was really interesting. So what matters most to a farmer is not how much moisture falls from the sky, but how much soaks into the ground. So as soil loses their microbial life, they lose structure. So porosity is replaced by impermeability. So on conventionally farmed land, glomalin is rare and infiltrations are low. Regenerative farmers report 10 to 30-fold increases in water infiltration, where the water actually gets into the ground. They want to put creatures on the soil. So nature never farms without animals. So, however, one of the hallmarks of modern agriculture is the separation of crops and animals. So for thousands of years, they had been paired together. Today's crops and animals are physically kept apart from each other. So in regenerative agriculture, the techniques of rotational grazing promote increases in soil carbon and also fertility. So we want to recognize that soil health is planet health is human health. So there can be no planet health without soil health, and there can be no human health without planet health. So even if you are eating a nutritious, nourishing diet, the plants you consume will not contain sufficient essential minerals if they are scarce in the soil. So true regenerative farming improves plant health and human nutrition without trying, for a simple reason. It does not fight nature, it aligns with nature. People. So things are good for many people, yet if we look more broadly, a greater portion of humanity is anxious, hurting, or living in fear. People face loss of rights, land, livelihood, income, food security, or opportunity. So a sense of connectedness to others provides respect and honor, a universal need, a quality that is essential if we are to come together and end the climate crisis. This is really important. We would be wise to listen to the people who are enduring the greatest harm caused by climate change, who endure hunger and poverty, people who experience firsthand what needs to change and how we might do so. We hear a lot of technical solutions. We hear from scientists a lot. However, there are people who understand that comprehensive solutions to climate change encompass a far broader landscape of understanding and practices, yet their voices are seldom heard because they can be drowned out by the opinions of the privileged. So regenerative solutions that are mentioned are indigenous women in food and education of girls. So indigenous means originating or occurring naturally in a specific land or region. The vast majority of indigenous nations did not and still do not see the land as belonging, but saw themselves as belonging to the land. So indigenous people thrived on the land and sea for thousands of years because of intimate knowledge of the weather, botany, animals, migrations, medicines, forests, food, and the oceans. Some indigenous nations existed in places that most people would die very quickly. So worldwide, indigenous people are struggling to save their traditional lands from exploitation and species extinction. This is a great quote. It says, if you are going to save only the insects and animals and not indigenous people, there is a big contradiction. Education of girls. Everything works better, everything, when girls are fully educated and empowered. The impact of girls' education would have is extraordinary. Funding is the limiting factor for many countries, also because they don't want to spend the money to provide separate bathrooms and menstrual products. But there is overwhelming evidence that having educated women radically reduces infant mortality, child marriage, family size, and HIV and AIDS. Conversely, it increases health, economic well-being, agricultural yields, and social stability. Education of girls continued, but there is something more profound at stake: the minds and intelligence of women. Women bring different skills, thinking, perspectives, and attitudes about collaboration to institutions, governance, and businesses. This is a beautiful quote from Lima. She's a 15-year-old woman from Afghanistan. And it says, "You won't allow me to go to school. I won't become a doctor. But remember this, one day you will be sick." This is precisely where we're at right now, globally. We need everyone involved and engaged in the regeneration of the earth, its people, and its inhabitants. The city. The needs, wants, and demands of cities ultimately degrade life in all of its forms. It's largely unseen by its inhabitants, and reshaping cities for the long-term health of humans and natural systems is very important. So regenerative solutions include building, urban farming, net zero cities, the nature of cities, urban mobility, the 15-minute city, and carbon architecture. We're going to touch on net zero cities. Net zero cities balance the amount of greenhouse gases they emit with renewable energy and carbon reducing practices. So this can be accomplished through a combination of strategies, including integrated sources of renewable energy, electrification of buildings and transport, increased efficiency, and a reduction in overall energy consumption. Cities must carry through with their net zero pledges in an equitable way. So via initiatives that provide transparency, create equal access to information, empowering vulnerable communities, fostering innovation, and meet reputable net zero standards. Food, one of my favorite things. So today's food system has become the single greatest cause of global warming, soil loss, chemical poisoning, chronic disease, rainforest destruction, and dying oceans. Regeneration can reverse degenerated land, soil, food, environment, and health. And some of the solutions we're going to talk about are waste nothing, eat everything, localization, decommodification, insect extinction, and eating trees. So what we're going to cover is decommodification. Commodified food production is a positive feedback loop. So this is reinforcing practices that cause harm to people and the planet. Heavy use of machinery and reliance on few crops to grow as monocrops require increasing amounts of pesticides, insecticides, synthetic fertilizers, and genetically modified organisms. So this is to offset the declining fertility, rising weed resistance, and eroding topsoil. So decommodification is not looking at food production as just a business. It's actually producing food for people and is more than a business. Energy. So global warming will not be stopped or reversed without ending the use of fossil fuels. To reduce carbon emissions, we need to divide energy into 3 categories: source, usage, and application. Where does energy come from? What is it used for? And how do we use it? So the regenerative solutions are wind, solar, electric vehicles, geothermal, electrify everything, energy storage, and microgrids. And we are going to be talking about microgrids. So microgrids are locally controlled power sources that can integrate multiple energy resources such as wind, natural gas, or solar power. So this is tied into a larger traditional power grid, but can be run interdependently off local energy sources. Because they're able to operate while the main grid is down, microgrids can help strengthen grid resilience and help mitigate grid disturbances, as well as function as a grid resource for faster system response and recovery. Industry. So every industry or industrial system is extractive. Industries must reduce greenhouse gas emissions caused by production, transportation, and operations. Regenerative solutions within industry include big food, healthcare, banking, war, politics, clothing, plastics, poverty, and offsets to onsets. So the clothing industry. Clothing and fashion are 2 different things. Clothing is a need, fashion is a desire. It is an industry powered by coal, oil, diesel, gas, jet A fuel, and bunker crude for ships. The textile industry is also guilty of inhumane working conditions and poverty wages. We need to address 4 key issues here: phasing out of toxic chemicals and synthetic microfibers, changing the way clothing is made and marketed, improving the materials clothes are made of and promoting recycling, and moving to renewable energy. So one thing you can do is make a punch list. So you can go on regeneration.org/punch list. The link is up in the top right. But a punch list can be for an individual, family, community, company, or city. It is a list of actions you or a group will undertake and accomplish over a predetermined span of time: 1 month, 1 year, 5 years, or more. You can make different lists for different time periods and this week and this year, for example. our carbon calculator on regeneration. So using a carbon calculator can be an important step to understanding one's current carbon impact. For those in the United States, the University of California, Berkeley's Cool Climate Calculator is also one of the best we've found. And I just want to say, if you do this carbon calculator or make a punch list, send it to me and we'll get you a little prize, a reusable straw or something. I also want to mention that the University of Sarasota County Extension Office is an equal opportunity institution. So we are committed to providing universal access to all of our events. So if you have any disability accommodations that you need, such as sign language, interpreters, and listening devices, please contact us by either calling 941-861-5000 or emailing sarasota@ifas.ufl.edu at least 2 weeks in advance. So advance notice is necessary to arrange for some accessibility needs, and you can learn more at ada.ufl.edu and scgov.net/ADA. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. My email is right there, and I'm always happy to answer questions, so please do not hesitate. Have a great day, and thank you for watching.